Welcome to Just Go Ministries. For those of you who haven't met me, I am Jennifer Delgado. I have been ministering with my husband Ruben for the last 30 years, and I am a co-minister with him in Just Go Ministries. Today, Ruben will be giving his testimony. Ruben?
Okay, where do I begin? I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Quickly moved to New York. I was in New York maybe quick 6 months. Quickly made it to New Jersey. Just been in New Jersey pretty much forever. And just growing up through, elementary school. Has learning disabilities and things like that, very poor.
But you did go back to Colombia for a period of time,
Went back to Colombia, for, I think it was about a year. I was between the ages of 2 and 3. Mm-hmm. We went back to Colombia with my mom just to visit my grandparents and things like that. We had a situation there that we almost got stuck in Colombia trying to come back. It was a situation where someone at the consulate was trying very difficult for my mom to get back, because she basically just tried to ban her and to blacklist her, and there was a miraculous testimony in and of itself. That's her testimony, but she just believed for a supernatural miracle, and it was an amazing breakthrough, and that's a whole entire story in itself, and how we got back to the United States. But when I was just right around four years old, or close to it, that's when we came back. So it was about a period of a year that we were there.
Yeah. So even then, God had a plan.
God had an amazing plan, yeah. And so coming back to New Jersey, growing up through the high school years, like I said, learning disabilities, we were poverty, monopoly money, better known as the welfare.
Food stamps.
Back then, there was something called food stamps, and it looked like monopoly money. And it was embarrassing to go to the supermarket and you break out all of this money and you're paying, you're trying for people not to see you, but people see you anyway, so you just say, what the heck? And then your parents would send you, because sometimes my mom didn't always have a car, so I would just go shop, and she would give me a list, and I would be the one shopping.
And so what kind of relationships did you have in school?
So growing up, because I was diagnosed with some learning disabilities, more specifically ADD and the like, they put me in special class. And so once I got into that special class, there were learning needs, but there was also kids that had behavioral problems, or they were just wild and violent and things like that. I was getting bullied a lot. And so going into high school, what happened was I just flipped the script. Something happened. I don't know if the devil set it up, the enemy set, I don't really know what happened, but I know right around the 8th grade, there was a light switch, something that just flipped, and I took it from, the fearful kid that was shy, that was getting bullied, that was getting robbed. All of a sudden, it just completely reversed. I came in starting to just talk like a killer, pretty much. I'm walking in, I'm the tough guy, I'm the bully now. And I took it to extremes, and I took it to violence, where I had eventually got a hold of guns, and I started hanging out with the wrong crowd, with drugs involved, and I began to develop a reputation as someone that you should be fearing. And it was just kind of reversed completely. I don't know if it was because...
But you had a cousin, right, when you were growing up that you kind of idolized?
I had a cousin that was much older. He was more like an uncle. Being born in Colombia and having been involved with the drug trade, he brought it into New York, and he was heavily involved with the drug trade and the cartels from Cali. He was doing a lot of heavy drug dealing, where they would go scuba diving in the ocean and all the stuff that you see in high-level drug dealing movies. And so anytime that we would have an encounter with him, either we would visit, he would visit us, we would run into each other, he was always bearing gifts. He was always bearing, he wouldn't just come visit us. He would visit us and bring television sets and all types of things like that. And just growing up as a kid, it just struck me. He was like this Santa Claus, from the dark side, that was mysterious, and just something about that whole entire life just kind of grabbed my attention. And I believe that the devil was involved. I believe that the enemy was just setting me up and luring me and making this life be very enticing to me. And so I began as going through the teenage years, just wanting to desire to be like that and wanting to desire to kind of follow in those footsteps, pretty much.
And then even more so, right? Like he had a restaurant and you used to invite your friends and you felt. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so it was like this whole entire lifestyle because there was a lot of money involved and we were poor. We were on the welfare, but this is a lifestyle of tons of new cars, restaurants everywhere that was owned by him, penthouse apartments with your own elevator. You have your own private elevator straight to the penthouse, those types of things. And so going from that, visiting that lifestyle and then visiting the lifestyle of, welfare and, monopoly money while you're shopping, the devil just had me convinced that that's what I wanted to do. And so I kind of just set my mind at some point to, no, this is what I'm doing. I'm making a career choice. The guidance counselor says, hey, what do you want to do when you graduate from high school? And, my mind is like, I'm going to be a professional drug dealer, but I didn't say that. But that's kind of like a career choice that I basically had made.
Then you went into high school and tell me about that experience in 8th, 9th grade, because you said you had a learning disability and you were in school.
So this particular municipality, there was no buses. Some municipalities have buses that pick up all the kids. This municipality didn't. So you were either getting dropped off by your parents, you were walking there, you were taking your bicycle there. If you were in a special education class, that's the only time there was a bus. And so they called it the kids called it the Riri bus for short, meaning like the retarded bus. And so I was on that like pretty much starting from grade 1, to be honest with you. And so they just said I had a lot of problems in school. But yeah, that was basically the whole entire thing with.
So when you flipped the script and became like in the 8th grade, you said you didn't want to be bullied anymore. You became like the menace. What, like describe how you interacted with your peers and your teachers.
I just went into like demonic mode pretty much. Like my reputation began to become like if you basically mess with this guy, you might lose your life. And that's because people knew that I had guns nearby, they had seen me with guns, and I just built that reputation. There was some violence that had happened and rumors of violence and things like that. And I was involved in a lot of no good stuff. And so even my reputation, if they called me down to the office for, being written up, they would have a police escort because the principals and people were afraid just of my presence. And eventually I wasn't allowed to stay in that school, so they put me in a school that's more geared towards violent and more criminal type kids, juvenile delinquents and things like that. And so I eventually went that route, and it was a very rough school. And even in that school of like, the whole school was rough and tough kids. And even in that setting, I had a reputation where like, you can't mess with this guy. It doesn't matter how tough we are. This guy will put a bullet, in your head pretty much. So I had this crazy reputation and fear, and I just commanded that type of respect. And I would feed off of that. Like I really enjoyed that. I just craved it. I craved it at the time. It was something that was very demonic. And eventually, I knew that it was demonic because later on I sensed it. I felt that leading of the demonic spirit that would just push me for that. So.
And you used to tell me you had visions at that time of how you were going to die, right? You want to share that?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, just like God has a plan for us, the devil has a plan for us too. And it involved one of violence. And I even visualized that this would lead to my demise, meaning it would probably lead to me not living completely the rest of my natural life. And I was perfectly okay with that. I had bought into the vision that I knew if I accomplished this vision, that the devil was showing me that that would be everything that I wanted, and it didn't matter if my life was cut short.
So then how did you start to get involved with drugs and guns?
Yeah, I just started meeting people on the street. As you become a teenager, you begin to hang out and meet people in the streets. You began to just venture out, and you meet people. Yeah.
When you were like 16, you had another cousin or another family acquaintance, right? That you were going back and forth to New York, right?
Yeah. So besides drug dealing, I was also involved in racketeering with another partner, and that was just so it wasn't just drug sales; it was all types of criminal activity. Now, I was never involved with stealing or I don't know why. It's not that like I was like beneath that. It just it wasn't I didn't find it interesting. I just like the business side of like selling drugs and like doing things like that. Even racketeering was basically involving sales and things like that. And so it was very interesting. It was just a perfume racket, in that the partner that I was involved in was much older than me. He was 26 and I was just in high school. I had just gotten my driver license then, actually. And so we just kind of bribed our way into the executive circles of Georgia or Beverly Hills. And back then, this was so long ago, I don't know how that industry works, but when big brand name colognes used to first hit the scene, first year, they just kicked off a new fragrance. They would be exclusive in the first year or sometimes the second year. And so they were exclusive to certain huge department stores like Macy's and Bloomingdale's. And us, we were on the level of Macy's and Bloomingdale's. Nobody else could get this stuff. So wholesalers and other perfume stores, they couldn't sell it, only Macy's and Bloomingdale's. But now anybody that paid us could also sell it because we became distributors because we had worked our way into this situation. And we would have different rackets like that where we would work into certain situations where we were having merchandise that we weren't supposed to have and things like that. And so
how did you meet the people that supplied you with the drugs to sell on the street?
When I became of age and got involved in drugs, my cousin had already been arrested and he had went to federal prison, and because he was born in Colombia, he had been deported back. And so I just through meeting people on the street, that knew people in New York, I just started meeting people and I just tried to make it happen because that was my vision. And when you buy into a vision, I bought into the vision of the devil. And so I just sought out the sources and the connections, and I did find them. I found a connection in Manhattan with some very dangerous individuals. The person involved that was in charge of that organization, he was a much older guy than me. He was in his 60s. And I'm like, when I first met him, I was probably 15 or 16. And so they really liked the fact that I was really young and I was making a lot of money. And so to them, I was like a protege, so to speak. So they just felt like they should take me under the wing. And this is a very large operation. These maybe, I don't know, several hundred people involved. It could be like 500 or 600 people involved. And it was a very dangerous situation. As dangerous as I thought I was like Mr. Rogers in the neighborhood compared to these guys. These guys were legit horror movie killers where they loved to kill people. They wanted to kill people. They were hoping that certain people wouldn't pay them back because they just wanted to kill people because they felt it was good for business. They felt like if they killed some people, then that fear would reestablish the drug empire kingdom that they had. And that's the type of attitude that they wanted. They just wanted to shoot first, ask questions later. And I never really got involved in the killing aspect of it, thank God. But I was involved in the drug sales operation of it. But I say that to say this, that I was in an incredible, dangerous situation. And I remember certain times in certain meetings where I was in these dangerous situations where I felt the prayers of my mom. My mother had, she was raised up in the church, and she had brought me to church when I was growing up as a kid. It was a conservative church that we were going to, but nonetheless, it was a church that I grew up in, going into, the early years of youth, like say 12, 13, 14, and I stopped going around 15. But those early years, my mother would bring me to church, and in those dangerous moments, I felt the prayers of my mother clearly. Sometimes everything would just slow down, and it would just feel really strange. It would feel like, and I remember even thinking at times when I saw the danger around me, I remember times that I thought, I was like, that I could literally think, even in my mind, like I feel my mom's prayers right now. And it was crazy because I'm in the middle of this, and I'm riding the devil's plans, and I could just sense and feel the prayers of my mother just protecting me and changing situations that possibly could have turned into a horrible situation. The other thing too was I met a family member of one of the kids that was in my operation, and I remember meeting them, and this couple was completely different. I was introduced. I'd say, hey, this is my uncle, and so this couple was very, very different because there was something different about them, and I didn't know, but they were Christians. And when I went into their apartment, because we were always working in the neighborhood, and I remember that when I went in, they had Jesus paraphernalias like everywhere. So like I think it was in style, like in the 80s and 90s, because there was the popularity of the Jesus Book and Gift Store back in the day. And when you go into the Jesus Book and Gift Store, for those younger people that might be watching, this is before the internet. So before the internet, you would have to go to the Jesus Book and Gift Store. Also carried tons of Jesus and Christian paraphernalia. Mm-hmm. And so for some reason, and if you were a Christian that was really on fire for God, in a lot of situations, people would have this stuff adorning their house and everything. And so I just remember, when I went into the apartment, it would say Jesus and just different stuff about, just different stuff about Jesus all over the place. And it was just very noticeable to me. But what was really noticeable to me was that there was something different about them, in the sense that I felt like an uncompromised love coming from them. And because I felt this warm love feeling, I started going to them almost daily for a little while. Well, I remember myself saying, hey, we should rent the Blockbuster Video. This was something I remember. I would say, hey, let's rent a movie from Blockbuster Video. Okay, for those younger people, we used to have to go to the store to rent this thing that we would put on the VHS. Well, anyway, Google it. So they would say, hey, you know what? We'll watch a movie with you if you watch a movie with us, right? And so what they would do is they had Christian videos. They had Christian movies and Christian videos, music videos and things like that. But it was Christian based, and so I just agreed. I said, all right, we'll watch. I would go rent a Sylvester Stallone movie or something like that, and then I would just watch this Christian stuff. And this was like a whole different world for me, because even though I had spent years in the conservative Christian church, I really hadn't experienced a situation where I just felt this unconditional love coming from these people. And there was just something so different about them that the best word that I could say is I was kind of magnetized to what they were carrying. They were carrying something different, like a fragrance that I wanted to know more about. And so it kind of drew me to them.
How did we meet?
So me and you met. So we were set up just set up on a date by a friend of ours who said, hey, we're going to meet in the park. He said, there's this girl that I think that you would like. And that was it, I just took one look at you and it was over. That was it. So.
And what happened throughout that? You were doing this in the background?
Basically, the illegal activities that I was doing, I hadn't shared it with you. You didn't know that I was doing. I was hiding that fact. So you probably thought that I had a job or I was involved in business activities that wasn't illegal, because you and your family weren't like those type of people. Like you would not be accepting of that. So I hid that from you, and it wasn't until a little bit later on. How did you know that? Jen, you just know that because, just knowing your parents and visiting you at your house and just knowing you guys and your family was about education and just doing the right thing. And to be honest with you, you had both your parents in the household. And when you grow up a lot of inner city, you don't even have both your parents. So most of my friends and people that I knew, we didn't even have two parents. So right off the bat, like if you have two parents and everything is like nice, like in the household, that's already strange right there. And so you didn't give the vibe that you would be okay with that. And so I just hid all of those things in terms of, all of the dirt that I was doing. And eventually I couldn't hide it any longer because there was an arrest that took place.
How did that go?
So, Bill, because I was locked up, pretty much, I had to give you a call because I was missing, right? And so, right, you were going to be wondering, how did I just disappear into thin air?
Mm-hmm. How did you get locked up, though?
The way that everybody gets caught, doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, if you're very big and you think that you're powerful and whatever, people get caught through informants. Informants introduce police officers, or informants introduce the law. John Gotti got caught that way. An endless list of the highest and the biggest names that would seem untouchable are all of a sudden not untouchable because of just one word, and it's the biggest weapon that the government has, and it's informants. If somebody inside that you trust and that all of a sudden is going to work with the other side, and that's pretty much what happened. So we had undercover police officers infiltrated my little operation. We traded and exchanged, money and drugs, and that was all recorded and documented and taped. And so by the time that that the hammer dropped, so to speak, there was no defense or anything like that. It was all a clear-cut case.
So what did you do before you went to prison? Because you knew you were going to prison.
I bought an engagement ring for you. And I knew I had to go away, but, we had talked about if you were willing to wait. And so you were. And so that was it. And so we did, they gave me a 6-year sentence, but I ended up only doing 2 off of the 6, which is about what you're supposed to do on a 6-year sentence. Towards the end of that 2 years, as I applied for something called a halfway house. And when I went to the halfway house, I hadn't really read the Bible. I hadn't really sought God during the time in prison. A lot of people start right away because all of a sudden they're in this new, situation where they're in prison. People start reading the Bible. And then later on when they get out, they don't. For me, it was a little bit of the reverse. It was towards the very end where I got to this halfway house, and I was just on my last little bit of time. But when I arrived in this house, in this halfway house, there was corruption that was happening within the halfway house in the sense that the private company that was running it was corrupt. They would receive a large check from the state, and then after they received a large check from the state when you first entered, they would immediately begin the process of trying to make room for someone else by making your life miserable and by even setting up people with dirty urine that necessarily was not dirty. Because you had to be drug tested while you were there, right? Because now you're in the halfway house means you can get a job and you have access to the outside world. And so there was drug testing, and if you failed, you went back to the prison. And so that's one way that they would do to have a revolving door. They wanted to have a revolving door of people coming in, the state giving a big lump sum of a funding, because I guess that's the way it operated, and then them trying to just get you out as fast as possible. For the first couple of weeks, it's amazing. It's like, it's fine. You experience everything that you're supposed to in a halfway house, and all of a sudden you experience this turnaround where they're now out to get you. and you know it's deliberate. You sense it, you feel it, they're over the top about it. They're not trying to hide it because they could care less. And that's when I began to pray, because I had already experienced this freedom. I didn't want to go back. I was already starting to see you on the weekends when I wasn't working. And so I had this extreme desire not to go back. And they had an extreme desire to send me back. So that caused me to pray, because I felt that oppression and that I felt that persecution. And so that persecution just led me to, I said, well, maybe prayer works. So I started, reading the Bible, and I just started praying, and I was being sincere, and I felt the providence begin to happen as I was praying and reading the Bible. I felt providence. I felt like God came in and his blessing began to protect me from these people that were trying to really cause harm, And so that's how I started sensing God, and I just never stopped. I just kept seeking the Lord, and I kept seeing the promises and the prayers being answered, and it just kind of drew me in. And so I started asking more questions about God. I eventually asked my mom, I said, hey Mom, send somebody to the halfway house that's a minister. I have a lot of questions about God. And I met this pastor that was local to the halfway house in Newark. He came and we spent a couple of times, I had a whole bunch of questions, and I was just starting to really seek the Lord to the point where I was convinced that I needed Jesus, because my whole entire life, I even though I was still very young at this time, I was about 21 years old, but I was convinced up until that time that no matter what I did, I always made the wrong decisions, and I was kind of fed up with my life already, even at that young age. And I just felt like I started believing that God had a better plan for my life, and I just wanted to get saved. And so the reason why I started thinking, hey, I want to get saved, I didn't know at the time that I could get saved by myself. You know what I mean? I just had this idea because I had seen it, like, when you see on television, like televangelists and things like that, there's people that get saved when you're in a service, and people raise their hand, and a preacher and evangelist says, who wants to get saved? And somebody raises their hand. So for whatever reason, I had that in my mind that has to be the only way that it could happen. And so I made a decision. I wanted to be saved. I found out where this minister's church was, which was very local. I could just walk there because I didn't have a car. And so that particular Sunday, I just went to the church, and my whole purpose that Sunday, I just woke up and I said, okay, I have to get saved today. So I have to go visit this church. And so I went to this pastor's church just for that reason. What I do remember was that the church service was actually very boring. Okay, I remember he was preaching on Absalom, and I wasn't really interested in like what he was preaching because it was very boring to me. I'm just thinking, I can't wait till this is over because I just need to get saved. I need to hurry up and get saved because I got something to do. This message is not too exciting, but I know I need to get saved. And so when the end of the message came, he said, who wants to get saved? And I just almost jumped off my seat because I was just waiting the whole time for him to say that. And so he was like, does anyone here that want to accept the Lord? And I had both my hands up.
And then after you got saved, what happened next? What did you do with that?
I hadn't seen the people that I always talked about, the people that had paraphernalia and these people that I really loved to be around. But I remembered that they would invite me to church periodically throughout the whole entire time. They would always talk to me about Jesus. They would always invite me to groups because they had groups. They called them growth groups at the time. It was like discipleship group type of meetings. They would invite me to that. They would invite me to church, and then they would always tell me if I wanted to visit their church, they would say, hey, it's this big giant building that used to be a hotel called the Renaissance Building, and it's across the street from the Ritz Theater. Now, anybody that grows up near the city of Elizabeth, New Jersey, they know where that is. It's clear. It's like a monument almost, the Ritz Theater. And across the street, there's this huge building. And so even though this was years later, I always remembered that building, even though I had never been there. And so I got saved, and after that message being a little bit boring, I just said, hey, I think I'm going to visit this church. And this church was Calvary Tabernacle in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And so when I took the bus, I'm just trying to find my way. And, it was interesting because the place was a refurbished hotel, and it still had the hotel lobby. So when you're walking in there, it doesn't feel like a church because you have elevators, just like a hotel lobby has like elevators. And there's like a hotel like receptionist thing. Well, there was one staircase that wrapped around that looked like, the type of place where you would take like wedding photos or anything. So it looked like a hotel. It didn't look like a church to me, and I had never seen that before. I had always been in churches that had steeples, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so I had to go up to the second floor, and I eventually found my way to the sanctuary. And I remember that people, it was during worship, and I remember people just behaving differently in the sense that, they were singing songs, but people had their arms up, and people just seemed like they were loving God, and it was a completely different atmosphere and a completely different vibe. I thought it was a little nutty at first, but regardless of the nuttiness, it drew me in because it was so different, and there was something that was enticing, almost the way that the couple that I met, I felt that atmosphere, I felt that vibe, that Holy Spirit vibe, and it really just drew me in, And
what happened between us then?
Immediately upon salvation, I told God, I said, I want to live by every word that comes out of your mouth, black and white, because I'm a black and white type of person. That's just the way that I function. I can't have gray areas. And so I said, I want to just follow every word that comes out of your mouth. If I know that this is what your word says, if I know that this is what your will is, I'm going to do that. And I don't care what happens. I don't care. There's nothing else that matters except what you say and what your word says. And so when it came to us, even though you had an engagement ring, I know that the Bible says that we're not supposed to be unequally yoked, meaning that if I am a Christian and you're completely not a Christian, we should not be getting married unless we're compatible in that sense of that we're both following the Lord. I felt like there's no way that God's going to be okay with this, but I prayed it anyway. I said, God, the situation is the situation. I am going to live by every word that comes out of your mouth. And this is the situation. Your word says do not be unequally yoked. So what do I do? And I was totally expecting God, just from my common sense, that God would have me to dissolve our relationship and just break it off. And so I was really shocked. I remember that prayer meeting, like it was one of the craziest prayer meetings I ever had, because I know that I heard the voice of the Lord very, very clearly. And he said, no, you're not going to break it off. He said, you're going to get married now, which was triply shocking, because I'm thinking he's gonna be telling me to break this relationship off, and God said, no, you're not going to break the relationship off, but you're going to get married now. And I was just jarred, and a little puzzled and confused, but I know I had heard the voice of God. And so I remember calling you, and you could maybe share what you were thinking, because I called you and I said, hey, God said we have to get married now. I believe I said it that way. I don't know how you recall that.
Mm-hmm. That's what you said.
Okay. I said, hey, God said we have to get married now. Okay, so, and then you probably thought I was...
And then I said, no, that's crazy.
When God says now, obviously, we can't just run outside to the middle of the street, and get married. So there's things that you have to set up, like, right, with licenses and, like, with certain things, and trying to buy a wedding ring and trying to have a little place and things like that. So, like, now resulted in probably, 3 to 4 weeks or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Because I had said, I'm going to do everything that comes out of the mouth of God. I just obeyed that as well. And you did as well. So here is the part that makes that whole thing miraculous. And it's really this, that this is a whole entire miracle in and of itself, a whole separate little testimony within this grand scheme of things was that, and this will mess up someone's doctrine. Like this might mess somebody's whole theology, completely just throw them off the cliff. Because God told me to do something that's not scriptural. He said, you're going to get married to her. And at the time, you were not a Christian whatsoever. But I heard the voice of God and I obeyed the voice of God. Now, I want to defer because what I found in the Bible to be the closest, most accurate thing to this was when God told Abraham that he was to bring Isaac as a sacrifice to the altar, he began to follow that out in obedience to the voice of God in something that's against God's character. And he did it in the same way when I heard his voice. And his voice told me to do something that was out of character. But the important thing is this, that I knew that I heard God's voice. Abraham knew that he heard God's voice. I knew that when I heard that, it only meant one thing, that God is true to his word and he's never a liar to his word. So I knew at some point in those 21 days that the only way that God is telling me that is that somehow miraculously you were going to be saved. Because then it would become something that was outside of his will and outside of his word. And so I just had faith in believing that he was going to provide that. And so because of that testimony in my life, I understand why Abraham began to take the steps in bringing his son Isaac to the altar, in the sense that he knew that that's outside of God's character. I mean, it literally says, thou shalt not kill. But because he heard the voice of God, Abraham was convinced that if he would obey and go through the steps, he knew that God had no choice but to provide the ram. And it was the same thing with me. Even though it was something that I heard God say out of character, I knew that when that moment came, God would provide that provision. And sure enough, within 21 days, it doesn't happen normally, unless it's a miraculous situation. But within those 21 days, I don't know if you want to share that, but you just came to know Jesus.
The Lord, right? And so then we got married, and then our ministry began, right?
We started doing ministry in Rutgers, and we joined the prayer teams, and we just went heavily involved into the ministry right from the beginning. And possibly around 15 years ago from today, the church, Calvary Tabernacle, asked me to become an elder, so I served as a pastor, elder, minister, ministry leader, all of these types of things functioning at the local church. But I feel like even in the midst of that, I began to grow a little dry, and there was always a lot of questions in my life and in my ministry that I just felt like I should be at a different place in my life with the Lord, and even in ministry. And just going back to 5 years ago, I had an experience right before COVID. And, God speaks to me, God speaks to you, God speaks to many of our audience, and to all of us as Christians. God speaks to us, and I was no different. God had spoken to me many times, just like I had heard God's voice regarding to marry you, and that turned into a miracle. But this particular time, I was in my backyard, and this was God talking to me like no other time. I hadn't experienced it like this on this level, and it was in a different format. And so I was walking in my backyard, and for the first time, I heard audible. And usually when I would hear God speak, I would know it's God. I would personally know it's God. But this time, I heard something that I didn't even think was God because I thought it was audible. I heard, "What do you want?" And so when I heard that, I thought somebody was behind me speaking, so I turned around to see who was speaking to me, and there was no one there, and it was wintertime, and there was some snow on the ground. So I'm like, okay, there's nobody here, there's nobody in my backyard, there's nobody behind me. I must have heard things, so I kept walking. And so I heard the same exact thing, and it was audible. It said, "What do you want?" And so I just kind of stopped. I felt like I was going to turn around, but I already turned around, like nobody's here. But I know I heard it the second time. And I started walking kind of gingerly. I'm like, what's going on? Like, is this God? You know, because I'd heard God's voice, but like I said, it was completely different this time because it sounded so audible to me. And as I kept walking gingerly, God turned up the volume. And so that was the first time I found out that God does have a volume knob. He must have a volume knob because he turned up the volume. But this time, 3 different aspects happened at the same time. So I heard the same thing again, very loud. What do you want? But at the same time, 2 other things happened simultaneously. The first one was the Holy Spirit flashed my life before me in regards to what that phrase meant. You know, what do you want? And so he showed me my whole entire life and what it was, what I was doing, what my motivations were, where my energies were, what I was seeking, what my goals were. So he showed me all of that, and that question kind of focused on everything my life was, and is that truly everything that I wanted? And the third thing that happened simultaneously as both those things were happening was that I felt his hand and his anointing come upon me, almost like a touch from the Lord. And it almost like took me out. Like if the shed was not there in the backyard, that kind of caught me because I probably would have fell over. For lack of a better way of saying it, that question haunted me from that moment. I just couldn't get it out of me. Day and night, it just echoed inside of me, like, what do you want as it pertains to my life? And it caused me to have a self-examination of all of my goals, of all of my motivations in life, of everything I was working towards, of just things that I wanted to happen in the future. And I just began to re-examine, and I began to seek God like never before. I began to get into the Word of God, to pray like never before, to spend time with the Lord like I never had before. And it was a perfect setup because we were going into COVID, which was that shutdown where we just were going to have a lot of time in our hands. And so it kind of worked out in that situation where I just had all of this extra time to spend with the Lord. And I began to get revelations that I had never had before, revelations about my life, revelations about things that were in my life that I didn't know, had to be removed from me. And I just began to die to myself and to really hunger after God like never before. And a couple years later, which was now 3 years ago, it was one particular day where a culmination of this time that I was spending with the Lord just kind of came to a head. That's the best way that I could do. I can't describe it any other way. Like I was just at the point of all these revelations and being renewed. I was being renewed every day. And my desire for him and all of these things where it came to a head to a point of dying where I just wanted to die to myself like I had never died before, because I believe there's different levels of death. And I hadn't really known that until this whole experience. And I remember that day, like it was yesterday, where my son, this was wintertime, and my son had broken his ankle.
Our son?
And our son had broken his ankle, correct. And so I had taken him to the hospital myself. He had crutches, he had a cast on. And so this was about 2 weeks later, maybe 3 weeks, but it was 2 to 3 weeks later. He came down the stairs. I remember he came down the stairs like kind of sliding on his butt because he didn't have his crutches and he didn't want to put weight on his ankle. And he said, Dad, I remember sitting in the kitchen. And he said, Dad, this thing's not healing. It's already been weeks, and I feel like this thing's not healing. I still have the same amount of pain, and this thing's not healing. And I remember this was a very unique situation because I remember that I didn't even think. I just sort of said, when I heard him say that, he said, Dad, this thing's not healing. And I immediately said, get on the couch. God's going to heal you right now. It was instant. And the way that I said it, and what was going through my mind, it was as if this type of ministry, I had done it for years, like 1,000 times before. And there was no doubt in my mind. And so he listened to me and he laid down, he put his leg up on the couch. And I remember praying for his ankle and for it to be healed. And then I said, okay, now walk on your ankle so you can see that God has healed you. For some reason, I just knew that it would be healed 100%. And so I just said, walk on it so you could see that God healed you. And so when he walked on it, he started laughing. He was like, ha, 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 ha. And so I said, okay, you're laughing because you just got healed instantly and somehow you think that's funny. And he said, no. He said, I'm laughing because you did that quick prayer and like half of my pain went away. I feel so much better. And I don't know how you did that. And so I said, you telling me that you still are not 100% healed? He's like, no, but I feel way better. I said, get back on the couch right now if you're not 100% healed. So we repeated the process, and I told him again the same thing. I said, all right, so now walk on it so you can see that you're 100% healed. Mm-hmm. And he laughed again. He said, ha. I said, okay, the same thing again. I said, okay, so you're laughing because now you're completely healed and somehow you think that's funny. Mm-hmm. He said, no, but every time you do that, it's like I only have a little bit of discomfort left, but it's like 90% of my pain is gone, and it's every time you do that, this is happening, so that's why I'm laughing. And the only thing that I was concerned with at the time was, I said, you're trying to tell me you're not 100% healed? He said, no, but almost. I said, get back on the couch right now. And so he did. And we prayed again, and he was miraculously, completely, totally healed. And even though that happened that day, it was just a marker for my life that I had this new commitment and this new death that happened in my life that just launched me out, and some of the signs that followed, with that type of ministry and anointing, it just never stopped. I experienced revival in my life. I had read about it many times. I never had experienced it. I didn't really know what it was about until this happened. And then it was just a complete revival where I just began to minister also in ways I had never done before. And so the healing anointing became prevalent and deliverance just began to increase. People started getting saved. And I just couldn't think about anything else other than getting people saved, getting people set free, healing the sick, and I couldn't stop thinking about it day and night. It was hard for me to focus on my job.
Yeah.
That was now 3 years ago, and I'm just as much on fire, and I'm like revived as I was 3 years ago, and I'm just planning on taking it into the stratosphere. As long as we have the Holy Spirit inside of us, there's nothing that we cannot do, and it's not just myself. But it's for everybody. And so I started a discipleship group in the sense that, because he also said, Jesus said, make disciples. And I'm just hoping that, we can also, together, me and you, we can activate the church and just activate Christians into going out, into preaching the gospel and evangelizing and doing what we do, because the ministry is for everybody.
Doing what Jesus did, right? What would Jesus do? So
exactly. And we all have the ministry of reconciliation.
Right?
Yeah.
Having compassion on the lost. Amen.